In talking about Devil's Playground, you're bringing up a fascinating topic, which is so many of the films from that time are about coming of age. My Brilliant Career. Let's see.
Even Picnic at Hanging Rock.
And Devil's, and later on, Dead Poets Society.
And a very good movie. Yes, Dead Poets Society of Peter Weir. That's a brilliant film. And there was a wonderful...
Getting of Wisdom is another.
The Getting of Wisdom. There's a wonderful forgotten early Nicole Kidman movie called The Year My Voice Broke.
Wow.
I just forget who made it, but Nicole Kidman was the... naturally, her voice didn't break, but some boy who was attracted to her, his voice
But how
broke.
do we account for this? How do we account?
Well, I think I've always thought it's because childhood has great dramatic, and adolescence has great dramatic unities that adult life doesn't have. There are the parents. There is the fixed environment of the school. There are the teachers you love and hate. There's the mutual incomprehension between you and teachers. There's the uncertainty about the other generation, the repulsion and the attraction. And there's the insecurity of approaching other people. More intense, that is, in adolescence than any other time. So adolescence has great, and childhood have great intensity and great dramatic unity. And you might notice that so many first books are about childhood, from Angela's Ashes. The Catcher in the Rye wasn't the first book of J.D. Salinger, but again, childhood. James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a young man, and I think it's that fact that our childhood is something we always want to talk about. If someone gets us in a room and says, "Tell us about yourself," we'll always very quickly get back to childhood as an explanation for who we are.
Is this adolescence you're talking about, could we apply that to the Australian cinema emerging in the early 1970s?
It might be an unconscious reference to that fact. That Australian cinema was very interesting because, as you know, there is a claim that the first feature film was made in Australia.
Right.
It was made before the first feature film in the US. There's certainly two feature films, one on the Bible made by the Salvation Army, and The True History of the Kelly Gang, who were a famous gang of outlaws, and it's an archetypal Australian story. And then in the silent era, there were some great directors. There's a man called Raymond Longford. Then spanned into the 30s, where we used to see stories about the bush. We used to see the Dad and Dave series. Dad was a sort of naive country farmer, and Dave was his even denser son, and they were a number of those movies were made. In my childhood, near the beginning of World War I, 20,000 Thieves, about the Australian light horse, made by a man called Chevelle. Very fine film. Post-war, a very good Chips Rafferty film.
Overlanders.
Called the Overlanders, and also Eureka Stockade. Eureka Stockade was an uprising on the goldfields. So we weren't utterly bereft of Australian films, but it got worse during the 60s. People lost their confidence somehow, and they were making money out of the new medium, television. And then in the 70s, it was time for the resurrection, and that's what happened. And Skepsy was one of the makers of that revolution. He was sick. He told me he was sick of making documentaries for various industries and commercials, and he got the idea that he could use his business, whose name I used to know when I was younger and before I became demented, but he used his business to underwrite the movies he made, but he also got money from other sources as well.
Did the success of your work on Devil's Playground then lead inevitably to Chant of Jimmy Blacksmith? You worked together?
Yes, he told me very explicitly that he wanted to make a film that was cheaper and more intimate in its scope.
And a whole different tone, too.
And a whole different tone. And he wanted to do that as a prelude to making The Chant. I was impressed by him from the start. He was obviously such an intelligent fellow, but I was also hooked by his personality, as so often happens. He was such good fun to be with.
Kind of a puckish quality to his smile.
Yes, and as soon as he says anything serious about art or film, he has to undermine it with some grotesque joke,
yes,
or confession of his own wrongs.
Kind of a drollery.
Yes, so I think to talk about The Chant, I think The Chant had a problem that film has, as a film, and that is, in the novel, you can say how Jimmy is feeling.
Oh, yes.
He's full of utter revenge. It's not in the dialogue, but he's also aware that if he lets anyone off, his proposition that all the whites are his enemy is undermined.
Yeah.
It's like the SS men who let one Jew go. I don't know why they didn't let them all go then.
Yeah.
And it is the school teacher Macready who undermines Jimmy by being the human he is, and who, by being the human he is, actually saves his own life, but undermines Jimmy's cosmos so that he sends his brother away, which happened in real life. So the Australian Aboriginals were treated dreadfully, and they still were when I was writing this novel, even though we had overwhelmingly endorsed civil rights for Aboriginals in a constitutional referendum to change the Australian Constitution. And things have improved since then greatly. And we had freedom rides like you did here, where busloads of young Aboriginals and university students would move into a town and try by Gandhi-like methods to desegregate the town, to allow Aboriginal kids to swim in the local baths and so on.
Well, and how important was it to have David Gulpilil up there on camera, too?
Yes, indeed. It's also, of course, the reconciliation has occurred in Australia through government apology, through trying to do the best we can, not always successfully, and not always with the goodwill or good sense of all politicians. I was certainly shocked by the degradation of Aboriginal culture, and it wasn't their fault.
Am I going too far by comparing this interchange of civilization and the Aboriginal culture with the American experience of the whites and Native Americans?
At all. One of the first things that we blamed Aboriginals for was they were not farmers. Farmers were part of our self-definition, and we felt that if we could get them to farm, we could make them not quite up to our standard, but pretty much manageable. And you, in America, did the same thing. The question of farming amongst indigenous Americans, amongst the American tribesmen and women, was whether to give in and farm or not.